Cultural appropriation is when someone takes something from another culture without knowing or caring about its meaning or context. For example, wearing a Native American headdress as a Halloween costume is cultural appropriation because it disrespects the sacredness and history of the headdress. Now, some people might think that cultural appropriation is just a way of appreciating other cultures or celebrating them, but it can actually be harmful and offensive to the people to whose cultures you're appropriating. It can be seen to erase people's identities and contributions by making their culture seem like a trend or a commodity or a fashion statement. Cultural appropriation is different from cultural exchange, which is when people share and learn from each other's cultures with respect and mutual benefit, and when cultures evolve from the influences of the cultures around them. And that is where our society, especially I think the spiritual community, seems to occasionally lose its way. So let's talk about that. Welcome back, everyone. I'll be your host for today's broadcast, and for those who don't know me, I'm Dr. John Michael Salvato. I hold a doctorate in theological anthropology, a second doctorate in naturopathic medicine and healing, and I'm an author, a practitioner of Afro-Sicilian, esoteric Catholic, and Sicilian American spirituality and occultism. I'm also a retired Eastern Catholic Rite bishop, a Franciscan contemplative. I'm genderqueer, polyamorous, and a social justice advocate. We've all seen it. Flame wars going on in various social media spaces, conferences, and Discord groups, debating whether or not someone, usually someone who's gained respect and a following, triggers some folks. And cultural appropriation has a distinctive tone about it when folks become concerned about the right of another person to practice or teach Native American, Appalachian, Southern Hoodoo, Voodoo, Brujeria, Norse esotericism, Stregoneria, or any other form of magical practice, religion, or folk magic, or spiritualism. Sometimes the posts are respectful and forthright. They come from a place of sincere concern or reflection of genuine offense taken by members of the affected community and culture. Other times it can tend toward vague booking and other passive aggressive, even sophomoric attacks and gatekeeping. Cultural appropriation is a real thing, a genuine problem that confronts the spiritual space, especially esoteric and magical spirituality. And admittedly, in some cases, it's difficult to know where the line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation lies. Difficult, but not impossible to navigate. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. In order to understand why cultural appropriation matters, we need to understand the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural exchange. Cultural exchange can help us learn new things, appreciate diversity, foster mutual respect, and even understand our own culture better. It can also challenge our stereotypes and prejudices. It can make us more open-minded and tolerant. Cultural exchange is a great way in which we can enrich our lives and broaden our horizons while creating a greater sense of diversity, respect, and honor for those around us. Cultural exchange is when people from different backgrounds, different countries, different communities share their beliefs, their values, their traditions and customs with one another. This occurs both intentionally and unintentionally, as is the case when cultures organically exchange, particularly in both the ancient and the postmodern worlds. And that's what I think trips us up. sometimes, because we forget that things like race are baseless social constructs designed to impoverish and disenfranchise people under a colonialist or imperialist rule. Sicilians, including what we think of in the 20th century as Southern Italians, for example, derive most of our culture not from ancient Roman or Etruscan influences, but rather from North African, Celtic, Norman, Greek, and Basque Sephardic influences. Mexicans, similarly, not only draw from their ancient Olmec and Soconusco and other Mesoamerican cultures, but also from African, Iberian, Sephardic, and Mayan cultures. Even African Americans, who might often imagine that their spiritual traditions are solely based on the unimaginable suffering and bloodshed of the Middle Passage enslavement tragedy, followed by the terrorism that has continued through the American racism culture to the present day, often forget that part of their traditions, part of the African American spiritual traditions, were influenced by elements of European enslavers, Protestant Christian ideology. And so it's important to remember that what was originally just a veneer that was used by the African enslaved to hide and protect their reliances upon the Yoruba ancestors and the Orisha, but which eventually gave birth to much of the Southern Black Christian churches, is also responsible for some of the integration of some of those Protestant Christian ideas into what hoodoo is today. So maybe at this point I can offer a way to short circuit those who are already getting triggered or spiraling into a state of rage and asking themselves, what does this white dude think they are talking to me about hoodoo or the Black church? So let me start by saying, no, my skin is not brown or black. And as an anthropologist, I personally wholesale reject the construct of race entirely. And I've spent much of the last 35 years trying to deconstruct both race and religion in the Western world. However, my DNA is Afro-Sicilian, Hungarian Roma, Greek, and Maltese. So, like many of my ancestors, like my father, were darker skinned. And I was ordained as a bishop in 2004 at the Imani Temple in the African American Catholic congregation in Washington, D.C. So I'm familiar with the ways in which African American and Christian cultural exchange can play out in a mutually respectful postmodern way. Now, recently, I've watched two friends, both of whom I genuinely love and respect, get a lot of flack from both sides over two very valid perspectives on cultural appropriation and cultural exchange and integration. One expressed how wrong it was for so-called white folks to profiteer from claiming to be hoodoo practitioners, when hoodoo at its core was founded upon the literal backs, blood, and tears of enslaved Africans in the southern colonies in the United States. And there's unquestionable validity in that concern. It doesn't even remotely make sense for someone whose ancestors were not enslaved Africans to practice hoodoo, from my perspective, let alone to set out to violently profiteer from that culture's suffering. Now, sometimes it's easier to tell if someone's profiteering. Misrepresentations or misleading claims or teaching the wrong things under the name of a certain tradition might be made by light-skinned persons claiming to be a hoodoo practitioner or claiming to be a bruja or what have you. But remember, darker skin or even ancestors who were enslaved by the colonists doesn't automatically initiate you into a practice that most practitioners agree is a closed practice. So there are people of many skin tones who could be appropriating the hoodoo tradition. That means taking something that's not theirs, something into which they were not initiated or into which they have no rights because they don't have that ancestral connection to that practice. Now, on the other hand, my other friend that I was just talking about, is an authentic and properly trained practitioner of multiple African diasporic traditions. And because of her delightfully wry sense of humor, she posts some really hysterical memes about what she calls armchair hoodoo practitioners. And because her skin tone is perceived by some hoodoo fundamentalists who don't even really know her or anything about her as being too light, they attempt to invalidate her practice, invalidate her teaching, and they've attacked her personally with ad hominem attacks on both her teaching and her scholarship. And that's wrong. So maybe we can begin by defining or redefining cultural appropriation as taking what does not belong to you from another culture without knowing or caring about its meaning or context and using it publicly for your personal gain or enrichment. Your skin color doesn't matter, your culture does. One example I could offer would be the case of the late Raven Grimassi and his cohorts. And I'll pause for a second to give those who get easily triggered by having to deal with the facts surrounding Grimassi a chance to go ahead and just click off this channel. For those fortunate enough to be unfamiliar with Raven Grimassi, he was a respected Wiccan practitioner, authentically initiated into the neo-pagan traditions, who decided that he would deceive the public with a patently false tale about having been initiated into a secret form of ancient Sicilian or Etruscan Italian witchcraft originating in Tuscany, centered on the witch cult of Diana, really based a lot upon the bullshit story that Charles Leland passed down in his Gospel of Aradia. Now, much of his writing was plagiarized. Much of Grimassi's writing was plagiarized from or built upon misunderstandings of the writings of people like my Zio Leo, Dr. Leo Martello, who created from whole cloth his own Italian-American interpretation of Wicca that he called the Way of the Strega. And Leo Martello admitted to Margaret Adler, Margot Adler, that that was a made-up story, that everybody in that era was making up backstories as sort of a way of packaging their brand. At the end of the day, to the consternation of many of our mutual friends, I called Grimassi out on his appropriation and the complete falsity of the narrative he was promulgating about the magical traditions of Sicily and Italy. We had multiple conversations about them. He seemed to be a delightful person, a genuine person, albeit a little bit arrogant, and I didn't hold him in contempt for that because I've been accused of being arrogant myself, and probably rightly so. So there's no question that appropriation is a problem in the spiritual space. And it's not just confined to appropriation of Native American or African American or Latin American traditions. But it's not as cut and dry as you might think. And it's complicated. And it deserves our attention. None of us was born in a cultural vacuum. As much as some like to pretend, particularly on the right, I was taught my spiritual practices from a first-generation group of practitioners who arrived in the United States at or just before the turn of the 20th century in the Common Era. So one might presume that my practices were entirely Afro-Sicilian and Southern Italian, right? No, because I wasn't born until 1963, and I didn't begin to learn these practices until 1969, and that meant that those who were teaching me, despite being born in the old country, despite having come from an authentic Afro-Sicilian tradition, lived in the United States for about a half a century by the time they first started teaching me. They were forced to hide their practices beneath the veneer of traditional Catholicism when they arrived in this country, and this was necessary because of the discrimination, the indenturement, the servitude of many of our ancestors from Sicily who were perceived as being black, that resulted in the largest single lynching in U.S. history in New Orleans, in which a mob lynched Sicilian immigrants for an alleged crime that they never committed. So we used that Catholic veneer, much as our distant cousins in the Afro-Caribbean and Creole traditions would have done with voodoo and Santeria and Candomblé and other traditions like that. World events like the assassination of JFK and civil rights champions Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy, and the birth of the gay rights movement, the women's rights movement, and so forth, reshaped and influenced my direct ancestors' worldview as they were living in the United States in the 60s. So what I was taught was born out of authentic and ancient Afro-Sicilian folk magic, but when I was being taught, it had evolved into a Sicilian American tradition, or a Napolitan American tradition, or a Sorrentino American tradition. And that's because magical practices are living traditions, not old world religions. And so it seems to me that whether you're someone who finds value in closed initiatory traditions like most neo-pagan and African diasporic religions do, or if you're more like those of us who find the entire construct of closed practices to stink of the same colonialist oppression that poisons most institutional religions, one thing is for certain: your skin tone and your perceived heritage ought not be a factor in determining whether or not you can practice what you practice. Now, that doesn't give you license to go out and profiteer off of something that's not yours. And before my neo-pagan friends allow their desire to be politically correct and supersede common sense and compassion, let me just remind you that by your own standards of outrage, most American and British neo-pagans are rampantly appropriating and have been for nearly 3/4 of a century. A final word I hope that those who are shouting the loudest about these things will remember is that cultural appropriation cuts both ways. So look deeply at your own history of giving your power to and the right to profiteer over to your oppressors as well, including those who participate in workshops and conferences and other events derived from the European colonialist 20th century traditions like neo-paganism, Wicca, or New Age constructs like including Reiki and crystals and other forms of healing. Maybe clean up your own backyard before you set out to gatekeep. Maybe look at what your story is before you start to condemn the stories of others who are trying their very best. Now, that doesn't give a pass to those who are knowingly profiteering, and you know who you are. But let's take a minute before we jump on the bandwagon attacking people who have a genuine right, an authentic right, to practice the spiritual path that resonates deeply with them. And let's stay in our own lanes. This is Dr. John Michael Salvato. You've been watching the Inner Alchemy live broadcast. We hope to see you again. Be sure to mention in the comments what you thought of this, share your perspectives, your views, and let's have a genuine conversation about cultural appropriation.